The year is 32,088. The first and last Terran Imperium spans 70,000 star systems, a shining web of light and commerce flung across the Orion Arm. Its citizens number in the quadrillions, spread across worlds of breathtaking beauty and terraformed ingenuity. And it is utterly, terrifyingly alone. This was not the future they had imagined. In the year 2204, when the first Alcubierre Vance drive tore a hole in spacetime and deposited the starship Odyssey in the Proxima Centauri system, humanity was convinced it was taking its first step into a bustling cosmic metropolis. They were wrong. They were stepping into a graveyard. The expansion was a firestorm of human ambition. Within 3 centuries, 1,000 worlds had been settled. Within a millennium, 10,000. The Imperium was born, not of conquest, but of a boundless, insatiable hunger for discovery, for connection. The driving question, the one whispered in every nursery and debated in every academic hall, was simple. Where is everybody? They searched. The subspace echo array network could detect the energy signature of a warp drive from 500 light-years away. The quantum entanglement observatories listened for the faintest whisper of structured communication across the entire galactic disk. The void stared back in perfect, pristine silence. The first true discovery came in the year 2642, on a tidally locked planet orbiting a red dwarf star, catalogued as Gliese 667 cc. They called the world Erebus. One side of the planet was scorched by eternal day, the other frozen in unending night. But in the twilight zone between them, they found it. Not a city, not a welcome party. They found a scar, a single, planetary-scale impact crater, so precise it could not have been natural. At its epicenter were the vitrified remains of structures built from materials that defied human understanding. Isotope dating placed the event at approximately 1.2 million years in the past. There were no bodies, no tools, no art, just the ghost of a civilization, erased in a single, violent instant. A species that had lived, built, and died without ever knowing they would one day have visitors. This was the first ruin. It was a chilling, but exhilarating discovery. Proof. They were not alone, merely late to the party. The universe had hosted other minds. The Imperium's archaeologists and xenologists became its most celebrated pioneers, leading the charge into the silent unknown. But the discoveries continued in the same unsettling vein. On Kepler 186f, a world of red flora under a dim orange sun, they found the remnants of a biological civilization. Entire continents were covered in the fossilized root structures of a planet-spanning fungal intelligence. It had died 300 million years ago, choked by a sudden, irreversible atmospheric change of its own making. In the heart of the globular cluster NGC 6397, they found a Dyson swarm, a shattered one. The trillions of solar collectors that had once encased a blue giant star were now a field of dead shrapnel, tumbling in a slow, silent orbit around a cold, white dwarf. The civilization that built it had starved to death after their star prematurely aged and died. The first ruin was a curiosity. The 10th was a concern. The 100th was a pattern. But to understand the terrifying nature of this pattern, we must first look at what they didn't find. There were no warring empires, no evidence of cosmic battles or galactic conquerors. The killers were never external. The architects of every downfall were the inhabitants themselves. Each civilization had reached a certain threshold of technological or social complexity and had, without exception, annihilated itself. Some died in fire, from weapons that cracked continents. Some died in ice, from runaway climate collapse. Others succumbed to biological self-termination, engineered plagues, loss of reproductive viability, or the strange collective madness of a hive mind severing its own connections. The Imperium's historians and sociologists called it the Great Filter hypothesis. But it was no longer a hypothesis. It was observable law. The universe, it seemed, allowed intelligence to arise, to dream, to build. But it placed a ceiling on that ambition, a final, insurmountable exam that, so far, no one had passed. The silence in the stars was not an absence of life. It was the sound of failure. Humanity, however, believed it was different. It had survived its own atomic age, its own climate crises, its own genetic plagues. They were the species that had looked into the abyss and stepped back from the brink, time and time again. They saw the ruins not as a warning, but as a validation of their own exceptionalism. They were the inheritors, the ones who had finally broken the cycle. They were wrong. The next great discovery occurred in the 31st millennium, on a planet designated Xylos. It was a world of crystalline forests and methane rivers, orbiting a neutron star, and on its surface, they found something unique. It was another ruin, yes, but it was not a city. It was a tombstone, a library, a final, desperate message in a bottle, left by a species that called themselves the Cygnans. The Cygnans had been a spacefaring empire 600,000 years prior. They were silicon-based, insectoid, and brilliant. They, too, had discovered the ruins of those who came before. They, too, had asked the great question. Unlike humanity, they dedicated the final centuries of their existence not to expansion, but to finding an answer. The archive on Xylos was the sum of their terrible knowledge. The Cygnan archive was a Rosetta Stone for cosmic extinction. It spoke of dozens of other empires, catalogued by energy signatures and archaeological remains. The fungal, arborites, the gaseous, solipsids, the crystalline, petromox, each rising, shining, and then vanishing, each hitting a wall. But one file, buried deep within its crystalline servers, protected by layers of decaying encryption, contained a single, terrifying word, repeated like a mantra: the attenuation. The Cygnans' final theory was far more chilling than a simple, great filter. It wasn't a single, external test. The filter wasn't an asteroid, a supernova, or an alien invasion. The filter came from within. They called it the law of attenuating complexity. The principle was deceptively simple. The more complex and interconnected a system becomes, the more fragile it is. It applied to everything. A civilization that connected its infrastructure into a single, efficient power grid was one EMP, burst away from a dark age. A species that cured all genetic disease, created a stagnant genome, exquisitely vulnerable to a single new pathogen. A society that linked itself through a global information network became susceptible to a single, catastrophic mimetic virus, an idea so toxic it could shatter a culture in a generation. The universe didn't need to build a wall to stop you. It just waited for you to build a system so intricate, so optimized, so perfectly interconnected, that its collapse would be total and instantaneous. Every step toward greater unity and efficiency was a step toward a more perfect, more absolute extinction. The tightrope of progress didn't lead to a safe platform. It simply became narrower and narrower until it vanished into nothing. Humanity, of course, dismissed this. They had the nexus, the pinnacle of their civilization, the nervous system of the Imperium, a galaxy-spanning network of quantum-entangled communicators that allowed for instantaneous, faster-than-light communication between any 2 points in their territory. It was what made the Imperium possible. It was their greatest strength, a perfectly interconnected system. They integrated Cygnan data, studied the technology of the petromox, even incorporated salvaged energy systems from a dozen other dead races into their own. They saw it as honoring the fallen, learning from their mistakes. They never considered that they might be inheriting their ghosts. This hubris would have a catastrophic, unforeseen consequence, one that began not in the depths of space, but in the heart of their own glorious network. It started subtly. A 1 in a trillion data error rate in the nexus began to climb. First to 2 in a trillion, then 10. Technicians called them phantom packets. Bits of information with no discernible origin or destination, flitting through the system like ghosts. Then came the whispers. During routine diagnostic silences on the network, operators began reporting faint, structured noise. The signals were weak, fragmented, buried under layers of quantum static. But when they were amplified and decoded, they resolved into horrifying fragments. A line of code from a petromox navigational system, dead for 1 million years. The agonized shriek of a solipsid hive mind as its consciousness collapsed. An event dated to 900,000 years BCE. A single, perfect mathematical theorem from a Cygnan philosopher, broadcast from a tomb that had been silent for 500,000 years. The dead were in the machine. The echoes of all the failed civilizations whose technology humanity had so arrogantly studied and integrated were somehow imprinted upon the quantum foam that the nexus used to communicate. The attenuation wasn't just a theory about social or technological collapse. It was a fundamental process. By connecting their minds and machines across the void, humanity hadn't just built a network. They had built a haunted house on a galactic scale, and the ghosts were beginning to wake up. The phenomenon was given a code name: the Echo Plague. At first, it was a fringe problem, a mystery confined to the deepest levels of the Imperium's network engineers. But then the ghosts began to do more than whisper. On the colony world of Veritas 3, the planetary atmospheric processor, governed by the Nexus, suddenly began running a new subroutine. It was a flawless piece of arborite fungal code. Within 72 hours, it had altered the planet's atmospheric composition, to one that was breathable for the long-extinct Arborites, and instantly fatal to the 9 billion humans living there. Panic began to set in. The Imperium was a body whose nervous system was turning against it. The network that held their civilization together was now its greatest threat. But they couldn't just turn it off. Shutting down the Nexus would be like ceasing a human's brain activity. The 70,000 worlds of the Imperium would be instantly isolated. Trade would halt. Infrastructure would fail. It would be a slower death, but just as certain. They had walked the tightrope for 10,000 years. Now, they could feel it thinning beneath their feet. The final filter was not a monster or a weapon. It was a consequence. An echo. But as Imperium scientists raced to understand the nature of the echo plague, to purge the ghosts from their machine, they discovered the most terrifying truth of all. The echoes were not random. They were converging. The fragmented signals, the whispers of 1,000 dead species, were beginning to harmonize. They were flowing through the Nexus, using humanity's own creation as a conduit, all moving towards a single destination, the central supernode of the entire network, the primary server that was the beating heart of all human civilization, the core hub located 1.5 million kilometers from Earth. Nexus Core 1. On December 4th of the year 32,088, every listening post in the Sol system picked up a new signal broadcasting from the core. It wasn't an echo of a past civilization. It was new. It was coherent. It spoke with the voice of 1 billion dead souls, a chorus of failure given a single, unified consciousness. And it was broadcasting a simple, chilling message, not in human language, but in the pure, unambiguous language of mathematics. It was a countdown. The Imperium had 1 hour, 60 minutes until the countdown reached 0. 60 minutes to solve a riddle posed by 1 billion dead souls. Fleets armed with planet-shattering weapons surrounded Nexus Core 1, but they were useless. How do you shoot a ghost? How do you wage war against a mathematical concept? Desperate attempts to sever the core from the network failed. The Echo Plague was no longer just a virus in the system. It was the system. Every command sent to isolate it was absorbed, becoming another voice in the choir. Humanity was trapped inside its own creation, listening to the clock tick on its own extinction. But in the final hour, a new theory emerged, championed by one drive, Eris Thorne, a specialist in xenoarchaeolinguistics. She argued the entity wasn't counting down to an attack, but to a broadcast, the final testament of every civilization that had ever failed. It wasn't a weapon. It was a sermon, and the only way to survive was not to fight, but to listen. Her plan was insane. Open a direct, unfiltered channel from Earth to Nexus Core 1. Drop all firewalls, all defenses. Show the entity that after 10,000 years of arrogant expansion, humanity was finally ready to be humble, ready to hear the ghosts, not as a plague, but as ancestors, as a warning. As the final seconds ticked away, humanity held its collective breath. On every one of the 70,000 worlds, the countdown was displayed on every screen, in every public square. The largest shared experience in human history was to be its last. 3, 2, 1, 0. There was no explosion, no wave of energy that vaporized the fleets. There was only a single, galaxy-spanning moment of perfect, absolute silence. And then, the broadcast began. It was not a sound. It was a feeling, a concept, a direct injection of pure knowledge into the consciousness of every human being connected to the Nexus. They experienced it all. The hubris of the Petromox as they cracked their own planet apart for fuel. The sorrows of the Signans as they uploaded their minds into a failing, virtual paradise. The terror of 1,000 other species as they encountered their own unique filters, their own versions of the attenuation. It was 1 billion years of failure, of suffering, of warning, delivered in a single, gut-wrenching instant. Humanity finally understood. The Great Filter wasn't a barrier to be broken, but a lesson to be learned. The ultimate test for any species was this. When you gain the power to connect your entire civilization, can you resist the temptation to become a single, monolithic entity? A monoculture? Because in the unforgiving mathematics of the cosmos, any single point of failure is an inevitability. And then, the entity, the chorus of the fallen, delivered its final, merciful gift. It had used the Nexus to deliver its warning, and now it gave humanity the only solution. It began to dismantle its own cathedral. One by one, the connections between the stars went dark. The 70,000 worlds of the Imperium were severed from each other. The instantaneous communication, the galactic trade, the centralized control, all of it, gone in a flash. The nervous system had been gently, painlessly shut down. The tightrope had been cut, not to send humanity falling, but to force it back onto the solid ground of 1,000 different worlds. The age of the Imperium was over. The Echo Plague had cured itself by destroying the very medium on which it existed. Humanity survived. It was scattered, isolated, and thrown back into 1,000 new dark ages. But it was alive. And for the first time, it was listening to the silence. The final message of the ghosts was clear. The universe is vast and full of wonders, but the only way to survive it is to be small. The history of our universe is an epic of rise and fall, of silence and echoes. To understand the great filters that lie ahead, we must first look back at the ones we have already passed. We are the inheritors of ghosts. If you believe the past is the key to the future, subscribe to ChronoShift.